The bell above the cafe door gave its usual tired chime as Walt Strickland stepped inside, his boots scuffing gently against the checkered floor tiles that hadn't changed since the 70s. The smell hit him first, a comforting mix of overused fryer oil, burnt toast, and sweet maple syrup clinging to the air like memory. Outside, the November morning pushed through the glass with gray light, but inside Lester's cafe, time stood still. Walt pulled his collar tighter around his neck before letting the door ease shut behind him. No one looked up. A waitress slid a plate across the counter, a teenager laughed into his phone near the register, and the jukebox in the corner buzzed with another Patsy Cline song stuck on eternal replay. Walt made his way to his usual booth by the window, his knees cracking with every step. He moved slow, not out of weakness, but with the care of someone who had carried weight most of his life, and had learned the cost of rushing. His faded flannel jacket shifted as he reached out to brace himself against the table. For a moment, the cuff pulled back just enough to reveal a portion of the tattoo inked on his forearm, faded, barely legible to the untrained eye. But it caught the attention of Travis behind the counter. The young server elbowed the guy next to him and muttered, "Looks like prison ink," with a grin too wide for the joke's quality. Walt heard it, but didn't flinch. He never did. He simply eased into the vinyl booth, which creaked beneath his weight like it always had, and waited. A few tables down, a boy named Noah Brewster looked up from his sketchpad. He'd seen the old man before, always in that same booth, same time, never needing a menu. Noah narrowed his eyes slightly as he tried to get a clearer view of the tattoo. He wasn't sure why, but something about it intrigued him. Maybe it was the shape, or maybe it was how everyone ignored it like it didn't matter. Noah began sketching quickly, glancing up every few seconds, trying not to be obvious. Biscuit and gravy. Black coffee. No cream, Walt said without lifting his eyes. He didn't need to. He never had to ask. Travis rolled his eyes. Yeah, the usual," he muttered before turning to the new girl behind the counter. "He's been ordering that since Lincoln got shot." The girl with the nose ring stifled a laugh. Walt didn't even blink. He kept his gaze out the window where leaves in gold and red danced down the sidewalk, settling into the cracks like they had every fall since he could remember. The plate came a few minutes later, first the biscuit, then the gravy, poured without a word. Walt dabbed the corner of his mouth with a paper napkin before even taking a bite. He moved deliberately, with a kind of quiet precision that suggested habit more than hunger. His coffee cup was refilled twice. Once by Lana, the manager, who always seemed to float through the cafe with a clipboard in hand and a mind full of 1,000 things. She gave him a quick nod. Out of courtesy, not warmth, and kept moving. The second refill came from the new girl, who didn't make eye contact. Walt didn't expect her to. The cafe filled with its usual sounds, the hum of conversation, the clink of silverware, the muffled bass of a delivery truck pulling up to the pharmacy next door. Outside, 3 retirees in windbreakers shuffled into the corner store. Inside, nothing changed. Until it did. Travis, still wiping his hands on a towel, looked toward Walt again and leaned over the counter just a little too loud. "Bet that tattoo's from a bar fight," he said. "Not a battlefield." Laughter followed. Sharp, juvenile, too comfortable in its cruelty. The sound floated through the cafe like steam from a forgotten cup. Walt finished his meal slowly, folding his napkin with the same care he'd folded letters long ago. He slid 2 wrinkled bills under the salt shaker, adjusted the sleeves of his flannel, and stood. His knees groaned in protest, but he didn't wince. As he moved toward the door, Travis caught his eye for a split second, then looked away. Not from guilt, just the discomfort of being seen. Walt stepped outside into the cold air, the wind tugging at his collar like an old friend with a long memory. He didn't head straight to his truck across the street. Instead, he paused at the brick wall of the cafe and leaned against it. Through the window, Noah was still sketching, his pencil moving with new purpose now. He wasn't hiding it anymore. Their eyes met briefly. Walt didn't smile, didn't nod. He just looked. And in that look was something Noah couldn't quite name but felt all the same, a silence full of weight, not emptiness. A silence earned. The jukebox inside skipped again, this time cutting Patsy Cline off mid-verse and replacing her with static before settling into quiet. Lana walked over and gave the machine a thump. It resumed as if nothing had happened. Walt pushed away from the wall and crossed the street slowly, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. The truck door creaked open and closed with a sigh. He sat for a moment behind the wheel, engine off, just breathing. No one stopped him, no one called after him. But behind him, in a small sketchbook held by a boy who had been paying attention, something had already begun. A story, perhaps. Or the kind of remembering the world forgets how to do. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The afternoon sun had already begun to dip behind the rust-colored rooftops of Flagstone when Noah Brewster pushed open the creaky door of the town library. A little brass bell jingled somewhere overhead, not unlike the one at Lester's cafe, though this one sounded more curious than tired. The warmth inside greeted him like a wool sweater, comforting and faintly dusty. The familiar smell of lemon wood polish and old pages wrapped around him as he stepped in, clutching his sketchpad under one arm. The building was mostly empty except for Mrs. Jeff behind the counter, battling a stubborn barcode sticker on a thick large-print mystery novel. Her silver hair, always pinned up in a loose bun, wobbled with each frustrated tug. When she looked up and saw Noah, her eyes softened beneath the weight of her glasses which had, once again, slid to the tip of her nose. "Afternoon, Noah," she said, setting the book down with a patient sigh. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Or maybe drawn one." Noah didn't smile. Instead, he stepped forward, careful, and laid the sketchpad on the counter. "Mrs. Jeff," he began, his voice lower than usual, "do you know anything about military tattoos?" She raised an eyebrow, not mocking, but intrigued. "That's an awfully specific question," she said, then leaned closer to the drawing. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the shapes, the numbers, the triangle. She adjusted her glasses and stared a little harder. "Where did you see this?" "This morning," Noah replied. "At the diner. On a man's arm." He hesitated, then added, "I think he's a veteran. He's always there. No one really talks to him." Mrs. Jeff didn't speak right away. She tapped her finger softly against the edge of the sketch, lips pressed into a thin thoughtful line. Then she nodded, slowly, as if remembering a name written deep in memory's folds. "That," she said quietly, "is a unit marking. Marine Corps. 2nd Recon Battalion if I'm not mistaken." Noah's eyes widened. "Really?" She smiled, the kind of smile that carried history in its corners. "Not all heroes wear capes, Noah. Some wear orthopedic shoes and eat biscuits and gravy every morning at that same booth by the window." She disappeared into the back without another word, her sensible heels squeaking faintly on the polished floor. Noah waited at the counter, heart-thumping. He stared at the sketch, suddenly aware that the man he'd drawn wasn't just some quiet customer. He was someone who had lived through something. Mrs. Jeff returned a few minutes later holding a worn file folder. She opened it carefully, like it might crumble if she moved too fast, and laid a photocopied newspaper clipping on the counter between them. The yellowed page showed a younger man in full Marine dress uniform standing rigid beside a decorated officer. The headline read, "Flagstone native awarded Bronze Star for valor under fire." Noah blinked. "Is that Corporal Walter Strickland?" she confirmed, pointing to the caption beneath the photo. "Came back in '71. Quiet ever since. Never talks about what happened over there, but I remember the day he returned. Whole town came out to welcome him. His mama cried so hard she had to be carried inside." Noah traced the image with his eyes. The uniformed man had the same square jaw, the same eyes, older now, maybe wearier, but unmistakably Walt. Just beneath the cuff of his dress uniform, that same tattoo peeked out like a forgotten signature. He felt something strange move inside him, something like guilt and reverence mixed together. He looked back at Mrs. Jeff, who had returned to her book like nothing monumental had just been uncovered. "Does anyone else know?" he asked. She looked at him over her glasses. "People forget, Noah. Especially when someone chooses silence over ceremony." He nodded and carefully folded the article, sliding it into the back pocket of his sketchpad. "Thank you," he whispered, then turned to leave. Outside, the light had faded into that soft, in-between time where shadows stretch long but night hasn't quite arrived. As he walked past the diner, he saw the booth by the window. Empty now. Coffee cup turned upside down on its saucer. No jacket on the seat. But the shape of the man who usually filled it still lingered in the space, like the echo of a story not yet told. Noah's mind raced. It wasn't just about the tattoo anymore. It was about what it meant. About how everyone in that cafe could laugh, could look right through someone who had once carried more than his share of the country's burden. About how easy it was to forget the ones who didn't want to be remembered for the blood they spilled. That night, at his small desk beneath a flickering desk lamp, Noah opened a fresh notebook and began to write. Not a school report. Not an essay. A story. He titled it, "The Man Who Sat by the Window." He didn't know where it would go or who would read it. But he knew he had to tell it. Because some stories don't shout. Some whisper from the corners of diners, from behind worn sleeves, from the eyes of men who never asked for thanks. And if someone didn't listen, truly listen, those stories would vanish like the steam off a forgotten cup of black coffee. Noah wrote late into the night. He copied the newspaper article, cleaned up his sketch, and added notes about what Mrs. Jeff had told him. And when he finally closed the notebook and climbed into bed, the story stayed with him, quiet, heavy, and waiting to be finished. Just like the man by the window. Walt Strickland stood in the middle of Murphy's Market, staring at a shelf of soups that hadn't moved in price since last month, but for some reason still managed to confuse him. His hand hovered over a can of chicken and rice, then slowly grabbed it and placed it in the wire basket he carried at his side. A loaf of wheat bread followed, then a folded newspaper he barely glanced at. He didn't need to read the headlines. He already knew what they would say. War overseas. Politics at home. No room for men like him anymore. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a sterile glow on everything, and the tile under his boots squeaked faintly with each step. He turned the corner toward the freezer aisle just as a teenager with earbuds and a phone glued to his palm walked straight into him. The kid barely looked up. "Watch it, Grandpa," he mumbled, then kept moving like Walt hadn't even been there. Walt took a slow step back, nodded once as if to no one, and resumed walking. The kid was gone before the echo of his footsteps faded. He paid at the register without speaking, offering exact change and a polite nod to the cashier who didn't meet his eyes. Then he stepped outside into the brisk wind and turned his coat collar up against the cold. Across the street, Lester's cafe glowed with its familiar yellow lights. He watched it for a moment, saw the shape of a boy seated by the window, sketchpad in hand, leaning over like he was drawing the world in secret. Walt recognized him. The same boy from that morning. The one who noticed. He hesitated for a second, then crossed the street, but instead of going into the cafe, he leaned against the brick wall beside it, resting the paper bag on the ground. The air smelled of rain that hadn't fallen yet and distant chimney smoke. He closed his eyes and breathed deep. In the quiet behind his lids, the past returned without warning. March of 1968. A place they called Red Smoke. He hadn't seen it on any official maps, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the scent of burnt wood, diesel fumes, and the kind of fear that lived in your throat even when you weren't speaking. The village was quiet now. Too quiet. His unit had been pinned down for hours, waiting on evac that had been delayed twice. Radios were crackling nonsense. Ammo was low. Hope was lower. He remembered crouching behind a collapsed wall with Ellie Torres beside him, petite, fierce, full of grit. She was their medic, barely over 100 pounds but carrying a radio pack like it weighed nothing. She kept the younger ones calm, told jokes with bad punchlines, sang lullabies in Spanish when the mortars stopped. Everyone loved her. Walt's hands tightened around the edge of the brick as he remembered the moment it all fell apart. Mortar fire at 2:13 a.m. The blast tore through the night like a giant splitting the world open. When he came to, his ears were ringing and the sky was flickering orange. He stumbled toward the sound of someone calling, soft, cracked, almost gone. Ellie. She was curled against a stone, her shoulder torn, breath shallow. She pressed something into his hand. A letter. For my brother, she whispered. Please, don't open it. There was blood on the edge, but her grip was steady. Walt nodded. She smiled once, just barely. Then faded before he could promise anything. Back in the present, Walt reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small envelope. The paper had yellowed, but the seal was still intact. He'd carried it for decades, unopened, unread. He'd never found her brother. Maybe he hadn't looked hard enough. Or maybe he'd been too afraid of what the letter might say. Sometimes silence felt safer than truth. He stared at it now, the edge still bearing that faint smear of blood, and for the first time in years, he wondered if he'd failed her by keeping it hidden. As if reading his thoughts, the cafe door swung open and a gust of warmth rolled out, carrying the scent of cinnamon and bacon. Walt tucked the letter back inside his coat and picked up the grocery bag. He didn't go inside. Not yet. Instead, he walked back to his truck, placed the bag on the passenger seat, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. He stared at the cafe. Through the window, he saw the boy, Noah. Still sketching, more intently now. The kid had curiosity in his bones. Walt could feel it from a distance. That kind of fire didn't burn in everyone. And maybe, just maybe, this was the first time someone actually wanted to know what that tattoo meant. Not to mock it. Not to dismiss it. But to understand. He leaned back in the seat and closed his eyes again. Red smoke hadn't left him. It lived in the creases of his knuckles, the rhythm of his breath, the way he moved through the world like a man still dodging echoes. His phone buzzed once in the glove box, but he ignored it. No one called him except for appointment reminders and the pharmacy. He pulled out the folded newspaper from Murphy's bag and glanced at the front page. Veterans Day event scheduled downtown. Speeches. Ceremonies. Flags on lampposts. He wouldn't be attending. He never did. It wasn't for people like him. Still, something shifted in his chest. Not a feeling exactly, but a weight. He looked back at the cafe and saw Lana moving behind the counter, pouring coffee, wiping down the register. She'd always run the place with clockwork precision, never skipping a beat, never asking questions. Maybe she remembered. Maybe not. But the boy did. That much he was sure of. Walt tapped the envelope in his pocket once, then started the truck. As the engine growled to life, he glanced one last time toward the window. Noah looked up from his sketchpad, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met again. Walt gave a faint nod. Not a greeting. Not a goodbye. Just a signal between two people who understood something deeper than words could reach. And then he drove away, the truck disappearing into the November haze, leaving behind nothing but the whisper of memory, and a story just beginning to find its voice. The sun rose slow and pale over Flagstone, dragging a curtain of thin light across Main Street and waking up the town in patches. A few storefronts had paper stars stuck to their windows. The bakery handed out red, white, and blue cupcakes with tiny flags jabbed into the icing. But the atmosphere was muted, more out of habit than heartfelt remembrance. It was Veterans Day, but to most people, it felt like any other Tuesday. Inside Lester's cafe, the usual crowd drifted in. Regulars found their booths like migrating birds to old nests. The jukebox played its morning loop of classic country. The air smelled like bacon grease, overbrewed coffee, and syrup from pancakes no one finished. Walt Strickland arrived earlier than usual. The bell over the door chimed its tired song as he stepped inside. His boots hit the floor with soft thumps, and his jacket hung heavier than the morning chill called for. He nodded to no one in particular and made his way to his booth by the window. The same one. Always the same one. His tattoo, that faded ink just below his sleeve, showed a little more than it usually did today. Maybe he'd tugged the cuff back a bit further. Maybe the cold made his arms shift differently. Or maybe something in him had stopped hiding. The coffee was poured before he sat down. Lana brought it herself this time, quiet and brisk, setting the cup in front of him with a practiced hand. "Black, no cream," she said simply, then walked away. Walt nodded once, eyes never leaving the street outside, where flags hung from lamp posts, unmoved by the still wind. Across the aisle, Noah sat in a corner booth, notebook clutched like a shield. He wasn't sketching now. He was watching. His eyes locked on Walt, on the way he folded his napkin, the way he stirred his coffee slowly, deliberately. He had the folder in his backpack. The one with the newspaper article, the clean sketch, the notes he'd written in the margins after talking with Mrs. Jeff. He hadn't told anyone. Not yet. But he felt like he was holding something sacred. A story that didn't belong in silence anymore. Travis stood behind the counter, leaning on one elbow, lazily spinning a coffee stirrer between his fingers. Two of his buddies sat on the stools beside him, loud, careless boys with jokes too easy and laughter too sharp. One of them pointed toward Walt's arm. "Man, look at that ink," he said. "Bet he got that in a bar fight. Looks like something from a biker gang." Travis snorted. "Nah, he probably did it himself with a paperclip and a lighter in county lockup." They laughed, too loud for the quiet cafe. Lana looked over from the register. Her mouth tightened, but she said nothing. She poured another cup for a nurse in scrubs and moved on. Walt didn't react. His fork moved through the biscuit and gravy with the same slow precision. But Noah saw it, the brief exhale through the nose, the tiniest pause that wasn't quite a breath, more like a weight being quietly endured. The jokes continued, low and pointed, laced with a kind of performative cruelty. Walt sat through it all, silent. Stoic. Not out of weakness, but a kind of resigned dignity that made Noah's hands clench around his notebook. He wanted to stand up. He wanted to shout at them. But his throat locked. He was just a kid. A kid with a story he wasn't sure how to tell. Lana passed by again and refilled Walt's coffee. No words. Just a nod. Travis leaned back and called out, "First sergeant of breakfast, maybe." He chuckled at his own joke, slapping his buddy on the arm. The other customers noticed now. A retired shopkeeper near the door furrowed his brow. A woman with a toddler paused, spoon hovering in midair. Two older men near the window exchanged a glance but looked away. Walt finished his meal. Slowly. Deliberately. Like everything else he did. He folded his napkin with the same precision he had used to fold the flag of a fallen friend once. He placed two wrinkled singles beneath the salt shaker and reached for his coat. That was when the bell above the door rang, clear and sudden. 4 men entered. They wore dark coats, not uniforms, but the cut was familiar. Polished pins lined their collars. Their shoes shined so sharply the cafe lights bounced off them. They walked in as one, their presence shifting the room like wind through still water. All conversation ceased. Even the jukebox skipped, cutting Patsy Cline mid-note and replacing her with silence. They didn't have to say a word. The man in front, tall, with a silver mustache and the eyes of someone who'd seen too much to flinch, stepped forward. He stopped in front of Walt's booth and lifted his hand in a crisp salute. His voice carried through the cafe like a hymn. "Permission to stand, First Sergeant." The entire room froze. Walt looked up, eyes meeting the man's. No salute in return, just a nod, small, steady, weighted like memory. Travis dropped his coffee stirrer. It clattered against the counter. His mouth opened, then shut. His friend sat motionless, eyes wide. Lana stopped mid-step. The woman with the toddler whispered something no one heard. And Noah stood up, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the old man who wasn't just a quiet figure by the window anymore. He was something else entirely. Something sacred. Something forgotten. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent. It was the kind of silence churches were built to hold. Walt slowly stood. His coat remained on the bench. The four men at the door stood straighter. The tall one spoke again, softer now. "You carried 3 of us out under fire. 2nd Recon, 1968. We never forgot." Walt looked at each of them. One by one. Then said, simply, "We all came home. That's what matters." A ripple moved through the cafe like a breath being held too long finally released. Someone near the counter blinked hard. A fork clinked softly onto a plate. Travis backed away from the counter. I didn't know," he stammered. "I'm sorry." Walt didn't look at him. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about what we forget to see." And just like that, something in Lester's cafe shifted. Not just the air. Not just the silence. But something deeper. Something that would not be forgotten again. The air inside Lester's cafe had never felt so still. The aroma of coffee lingered, untouched, and the bacon on the griddle sizzled unnoticed. The usual morning shuffle of plates and silverware had ceased, as if time itself had been asked to stand at attention. 4 men stood in crisp formation at the entrance, their dark coats lined with ribbons and pins that caught the light like quiet medals of truth. They weren't there for recognition. They weren't there to perform. They were there for one reason only, to honor the man standing by the window. Walt Strickland didn't move right away. He held the edge of the table, his fingers firm but not shaking, his gaze steady on the tall Marine in front of him. The man's hand remained at his brow in a flawless salute, and the silence pressed deeper around them, the kind of quiet that wrapped itself around memory and refused to let go. Slowly, Walt gave a single nod. Nothing more. But that nod shattered the invisible wall between a forgotten hero and a world that had never bothered to ask. Colonel Jameson lowered his hand and stepped closer. His boots echoed softly against the tile floor, and with each step, the weight of the moment grew heavier. His voice, when he spoke again, was softer but no less firm. "Walter Strickland. 2nd Recon. Ken Province. You carried 3 of us out under fire. We've been trying to find you." Walt's eyes flicked to the others behind him, 2 with silver hair, one still standing impossibly tall despite the years etched into his spine. Each face told a piece of the same story. Brothers in arms whose paths had diverged after war but who had never stopped carrying the same truth. "You found me," Walt said simply, his voice like gravel and smoke. The colonel nodded, removing his cap with slow reverence. "And we're standing here today because of you." Walt looked down at his hands, then up again. "We all came home. That's what matters." The room exhaled at once, a collective breath no one knew they were holding. Lana stood behind the counter, eyes wide, her clipboard forgotten in her hand. She took a step forward, then another, moving like someone who just remembered where she was supposed to be. Near the restrooms, a faded bulletin board hung crookedly, covered in flyers for lost pets, yoga classes, and expired bakery coupons. She stared at it a moment, then turned without a word and disappeared behind the counter. Travis still stood frozen by the coffee machine, eyes locked on Walt. He looked smaller now, like the weight of his ignorance had settled on his shoulders all at once. His mouth opened as if to speak, but nothing came out. Walt didn't turn to look at him. Instead, he lowered himself slowly back into the booth, the vinyl groaning beneath him. The colonel remained standing. "Permission to sit, First Sergeant?" he asked. Walt nodded once. "I'm not standing all day," he muttered, his tone dry, but not cold. The Marines moved as one, taking their places at the booth with careful, deliberate motions. One beside Walt, two across from him. Their coats folded neatly, their hands resting on the table with a reverence that made even the salt shaker seem sacred. They didn't speak of medals. They didn't speak of battles. They simply sat, reunited not by ceremony but by something older, something that didn't need to be explained. Across the room, Noah watched, his notebook still clutched to his chest. His eyes were wide, not in fear, but in awe. The sketch he had made days earlier now felt like a window into something so much deeper than he had imagined. This wasn't just about a tattoo. This was about a history that refused to be erased. Lana returned from the back holding an envelope. Not just any envelope, but a dusty one pulled from a drawer beneath the register. She approached the bulletin board and began tearing down the old flyers one by one. The lost dog, the church rummage sale, the painting class schedule. Each paper gave way to something new. She opened the envelope and began pinning up photos. Black and white snapshots of men in uniform. Polaroids of women in flight suits. A yellowed newspaper clipping that looked exactly like the one Noah had found at the library. In the center, she pinned a copy of the photo of young Walt Strickland, standing tall in his dress uniform beside his commanding officer. The caption beneath read, "Awarded Bronze Star for Valor Under Fire." No one said a word, but everyone watched. The bulletin board had become something else entirely. A wall of honor. It wasn't official. It wasn't planned. But it belonged there. By the time Lana stepped back, her hands trembled slightly. She wasn't just decorating a wall, she was restoring a memory that had been left behind too long. At the booth, Walt looked toward the photos without a word. The colonel followed his gaze, then turned back to Walt. "She was proud of you, you know," he said quietly. Walt didn't ask who. He knew. "Ellie," he said, and the name tasted like smoke and rain. The colonel nodded. "She told us." Before he stopped. Walt nodded again, this time slower. "I never sent the letter," he said. "I still have it." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Lana stepped forward again. "May I hang it there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Walt looked at her for the first time that morning, and in his eyes was something like permission, like gratitude wrapped in silence. "Yes," he said, after a pause. "Hang it where people can remember someone real." He reached into his coat and pulled out the envelope. It was yellowed with time, the edges worn, the seal still unbroken. Lana took it with both hands, holding it as though it might fall apart at the touch. She stepped to the board and pinned it next to Ellie's photograph. The jukebox, quiet for most of the morning, suddenly clicked back to life. But this time, it didn't play country. It played something different. An instrumental version of the Marine Corps hymn, slow and solemn, pouring gently into the corners of the café. Outside, the wind picked up just enough to stir the flags on the lampposts. Inside, everything had changed. And yet, everything felt exactly the way it was always meant to be. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Walt Strickland sat back in the booth, his hands resting on the table, rough fingers gently grazing the edges of his coffee cup as if steadying himself for something unspoken. Across from him, Noah sat quietly, notebook still pressed to his chest, unsure whether to breathe or speak. The Marines had left a few minutes earlier, slipping out as silently as they'd come, leaving behind a silence that wasn't hollow but full of presence, like the air was thick with all the words that had never been said. Walt didn't look at Noah right away. He stared past him, through the cafe window where the town's flag stirred in a breeze that hadn't been there moments ago. His gaze was distant but sharp, focused not on what was in front of him but on something far older, something that had never quite let him go. Then, without warning, his voice came, rough, quiet, steady. It was March of '68, he said, his tone almost conversational, though every word carried a gravity that seemed to anchor it to the table. We were stationed near a village we called Red Smoke. Real name was something else, but none of us could pronounce it. The place had been hit hard, what was left of it barely held together with rusted metal and dirt. Nights smelled like burnt oil and ashes, and the ground never stopped vibrating from something off in the distance. Noah didn't speak. He just leaned forward slightly, eyes wide, letting the words come as if afraid they might vanish if he interrupted. Walt continued, his voice growing softer but clearer. We'd been pinned down 2 days. Radio said evac, but they delayed. Weather. Intel. Politics. Always a reason. I remember we were low on everything, ammo, water, sleep. But we still had Ellie. His lips twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. Ellie Torres. Combat medic. 100 pounds soaking wet but carried a pack heavier than mine without blinking. She was the kind of person who knew when a guy needed stitches and when he just needed someone to cuss at him until he stood up and walked it off. She sang in Spanish when the shelling stopped. Said it was for luck. We believed her. Noah's pencil began to move, sketching quietly as Walt spoke, not a drawing this time but words, trying to capture every syllable, every detail before it slipped away. She had this way, Walt said, eyes still far off, of making us feel like we'd already made it home. Even when we were crawling through red dust and smoke so thick you couldn't tell the sky from the ground. She used to tell stories about her grandma's tamales. Said when she got back, she was going to open a kitchen, serve only 3 things, and no one was allowed to complain. She even had a name for it. Ellie's Fire. He fell silent for a moment, staring at the steam curling up from the coffee cup like it held the memory of her voice. We got hit around 2 in the morning. Mortar fire came in sharp and fast. They always hit hardest when they thought we were weakest. First blast knocked half the wall out from the building we were using as cover. Dust, heat, screaming. I remember thinking I'd gone deaf until I heard her voice. She was calling for help. Not screaming, calm. Like she was reading a bedtime story. Walt swallowed hard, and for the first time, his hands trembled slightly. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out the envelope. He laid it on the table gently, reverently, as if setting down something holy. She was bleeding bad. Shoulder and side. When I got to her, she was still trying to bandage someone else. Can you believe that? She looked up at me, pressed this into my hand. He tapped the envelope with one finger. Said, "This is for my brother. Don't open it. Just get it to him." Then she smiled. A real smile. I didn't even know people could smile like that in moments like that. Then she closed her eyes. Noah stared at the letter. The edges were frayed, the seal still intact. It looked as if it had aged a lifetime in the lining of a coat that had weathered just as much. I never found her brother, Walt said. I never opened it. Carried it every day since. Figured maybe someday I'd know what to do with it. But I never did. The boy reached out slowly, not to take the letter, but to place his hand gently on the table beside it. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Walt looked at him for the first time since he'd started speaking, and what he saw in the boy's face wasn't pity or curiosity. It was something else. Something older. Something like understanding. "You're the first person to ask," Walt said, almost in a whisper. "In all these years." He gathered the letter again and returned it to his pocket, as if the act itself was part of keeping Ellie alive. Noah finally spoke, his voice trembling. "She sounds like someone the world should remember." Walt nodded slowly. She was the kind of person who showed up. Every time. Even when no one saw her. Even when it was just a whisper in the dark. A hush settled over the booth like a blanket. Not heavy. Not sad. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that followed stories that mattered. Back behind the counter, Lana stood near the register, her hands paused mid-fold over a napkin. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the words had floated through the air like smoke and settled inside her. She looked at the photos pinned to the wall and then at Walt, sitting across from the boy, his face marked by decades and yet softened by something that hadn't existed the day before. She stepped out from behind the counter and walked over to them. Without saying a word, she placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of Walt and a glass of lemonade beside Noah. Then she walked back, not looking for thanks, not needing it. Walt took a sip and stared again at the wall where Ellie's photo now hung beside others, some known, some unknown. But all honored. And for the first time in years, the weight on his chest loosened, just enough to let the memory breathe. The cafe had emptied out some by the time Noah finished his lemonade, but the air inside still clung to the weight of Walt's words like fog over a quiet lake. The jukebox now played something softer, an instrumental that didn't compete with the silence, only kept it company. Noah leaned back in the booth, his fingers still tracing the edge of his notebook, too full of everything to know where to begin writing. Across from him, Walt sat with his hands folded, eyes on the photo of Ellie pinned to the wall like a ghost finally allowed to be seen. The letter in his coat pocket felt heavier than ever, as if it had absorbed not just time but every mile, every breath, every memory that had passed since the day she gave it to him. Lana moved behind the counter again, quieter now, more deliberate, wiping things that didn't need wiping and restocking napkins that weren't yet gone. But her glances toward the booth weren't so much curious as protective, like she was watching over something sacred without disturbing its stillness. Travis hadn't spoken since the Marines left. He hovered by the coffee station with a dish towel he kept folding and unfolding, unable to meet Walt's eyes but watching him all the same. Eventually, he set the towel down and walked toward the booth, slow and unsure, like a boy stepping into a confessional. He stopped just short of the table and cleared his throat. "Mr. Strickland," he said, his voice lower than usual, stripped of its usual smirk, "I didn't know. I didn't know it meant something." Walt looked up at him, and for a moment, the cafe felt completely still again. "It always meant something," he said. "You just didn't bother to look close enough." Travis nodded, then dropped his gaze. "I'm sorry." Walt didn't answer right away. Then, with a quiet shrug, he said, "It's not about apologies. It's about remembering." Travis nodded again, then turned and walked back behind the counter, his steps a little straighter, his head a little lower. Noah finally opened his notebook and began to write. Not just notes, but a narrative. He titled the page, "The Man Who Sat by the Window," and started with the tattoo. He described the way it peeked from under Walt's sleeve, faded and quiet, like a voice waiting for someone to ask it to speak. He wrote about Ellie, about the fire in her, the songs she sang, the letter she gave. He wrote about the Marines who walked in and saluted without asking for permission. And he wrote about how it felt to watch a room full of people finally understand something they had missed for years. Walt watched him write for a while, the way his hand moved quickly, urgently, like he was afraid the story might disappear again if he didn't catch it fast enough. Then Walt reached into his coat one more time and set the letter on the table. Noah stopped writing. He stared at the envelope like it had just begun to glow. "I've been carrying this for over 50 years, Walt said. I didn't open it. I promised her I wouldn't. I didn't find her brother. I didn't even try hard enough, if I'm honest. I wasn't ready. Noah swallowed. Do you think you're ready now? Walt didn't answer. Instead, he pushed the letter toward the boy. I want you to decide. You've already told more truth in a few days than most people manage in a lifetime. Noah's fingers trembled slightly as he picked it up. The paper felt fragile, like it had soaked up every bit of history between then and now. The seal was still firm, unbroken. He looked at Walt, who gave a small nod. You don't have to read it. You just have to carry it right. Noah nodded, carefully tucking the letter into his notebook. I'll find her brother, he said. Or at least, I'll try. Walt's mouth lifted just slightly at one corner. That'd be more than I managed. He looked down into his coffee cup, now gone cold. I spent a lot of years trying to forget. Turns out, forgetting costs more than remembering ever did. The sun had begun to lower outside, casting long shadows across the cafe floor. The flag on the bulletin board fluttered faintly as the front door opened and a new customer stepped in. An older man with a worn veteran's cap and a cautious look in his eyes. He hesitated at the threshold, unsure if he belonged. Lana looked up from the counter, but before she could speak, Noah rose from the booth, walked to the door, and held it open. Welcome back, he said simply. The man blinked, then smiled, a little surprised, a little grateful. He stepped inside as Noah returned to the table, heart thudding not from nerves but from the sense that something larger than himself had just passed through him. Walt stood slowly, joints stiff, and pulled on his coat. He looked at the wall again, at Ellie's photo, at the letter now resting in younger hands, and at the cafe that had somehow turned into a place of memory instead of just routine. Hang on to the truth, kid, he said. The world forgets fast. Your kind of remembering matters. Noah nodded. I will. Travis approached again, this time with a folded napkin in hand. He placed it on the edge of Walt's table and walked away without a word. On it, written in shaky blue ink, were 7 words, "Thank you for letting me see it." Walt picked it up, stared at it for a long time, then folded it carefully and slid it into his coat pocket. Lana refilled the sugar jar near the coffee machine, but her hands were still for a moment as she looked toward the wall. Her fingers hovered over the edge of Ellie's photo, brushing it like a whisper. Something sacred had been returned to her cafe, and she meant to protect it now. Walt stepped toward the door as the jukebox played a solemn brass melody, not military, but something close. Something that felt like home. At the door, he paused and looked back once more. Not to say goodbye, not for thanks, but because this was the moment he had waited years to witness. A cafe that remembered. A boy who asked. A wall that finally told the truth. He touched the frame of the door gently, the way one touches the brim of a hat or the shoulder of an old friend, then stepped outside into the amber light of evening. The letter was no longer just a burden. It was a promise passed forward. And in that small exchange, Walt Strickland began to feel something he hadn't felt in decades, peace. The morning after Veterans Day arrived in gentle layers of gray and gold, with fog curled up against the cafe windows like a cat refusing to leave the warmth. Lester's cafe opened earlier than usual that day. The door was unlocked before 6, and the air inside was already full of quiet intention. Lana stood behind the counter in a soft flannel shirt that had once belonged to her father, sleeves rolled, hair tied back with more care than usual. A record spun slowly on a small player beside the register, not the jukebox, but something more personal, a vinyl of soft brass and reverent snare, the kind her father used to play when no one else was around. The notes flowed gently into the corners of the cafe like the hush of a prayer before dawn. In the far corner, a single white candle flickered below the wall of honor, its light casting a warm glow beneath Ellie Torres's photograph. The flame danced slowly, steady and deliberate, like the heartbeat of something newly remembered. Walt Strickland stepped through the door at 6:37 a.m., exactly 3 minutes earlier than usual. The bell above him chimed, softer than it had the day before, or maybe it was the way the silence received him that made it seem that way. He paused just inside the entrance, eyes sweeping across the room with the kind of awareness born from years of scanning uncertain landscapes. But today, there was no danger. Only stillness, and something else, welcome. Lana looked up from behind the counter and smiled. Not the quick, polite smile she gave the mailman or the nod she offered to truckers passing through, but a smile that held memory, apology, and quiet gratitude. She poured his coffee without him asking and walked it around the counter herself, setting it in front of his usual booth. "Black coffee," she said gently, then added, "and a slice of apple pie. Ellie's recipe. I had to call her niece to get it right." Walt looked at her for a long moment, the weight of that name settling softly into the air between them. Then he nodded once and murmured, "Smells close enough." He removed his coat slowly, folding it over the seat beside him, and eased into the booth. The cafe was still mostly empty, but those who had come in, Mr. Hardwick from the post office, a retired schoolteacher with a purple scarf, and a young woman in scrubs, sat straighter than usual. Hats came off. Voices lowered. Mr. Hardwick even held the door open for a teenager he normally grumbled at. No one made a fuss. No one tried to turn it into a scene. They were just, better. Noah walked in 5 minutes later, backpack slung over one shoulder, folder pressed tightly to his chest. His hair was still tousled from sleep, and there was a small ink smudge on his cheek, but his steps were purposeful. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight to Walt's booth and stood there, waiting until the older man looked up. "I finished it," Noah said, his voice low but proud. Walt nodded to the seat across from him, and Noah slid into place. He pulled out the folder, carefully unfastened the top clip, and passed across a printed stack of pages. "The Man Who Sat by the Window," the title read in bold at the top. Inside were clean versions of the sketches, typed pages detailing Ellie's story and Walt's courage, a scanned copy of the old newspaper photo from 1971, and a newer picture of the Wall of Honor now hanging at the cafe. Walt flipped through the pages slowly, reading each line with eyes that had read too many field orders and too few letters from home. When he reached the end, he closed the folder and slid it into his wallet behind the pocket where Ellie's letter used to rest. Then he looked at Noah with a gravity that didn't weigh down but held up. "Keep writing," he said. "The world forgets fast. You're kind of remembering, it matters." Noah smiled, a little embarrassed but glowing all the same. He tucked the rest of his papers back into his folder just as the school bus gave a soft honk from outside. He stood, nodded once, then turned to leave. From the back of the cafe, Travis appeared quietly, not in a rush, not distracted. His shirt was tucked in, apron tied neat. He walked over to Walt's table with a folded napkin in his hand. He didn't say a word. Just placed the napkin down gently and moved on to clear an empty plate from a nearby booth. Walt looked at the napkin. In blue ink, in Travis's unmistakably messy handwriting, were 7 words, "Thank you for letting me see it." Walt folded the napkin carefully and tucked it beside the folder in his wallet. Outside, the morning had taken on that crisp, golden quality that only came after nights of reflection. Light filtered through the fog in soft angles, and the flags on Main Street moved just enough to remind you they were there. Inside, the Wall of Honor had begun to grow. More photos had appeared, left quietly by patrons, slipped into Lana's hand or tacked up without a word. There were names no one had spoken aloud in years, faces that had sat at those very booths decades earlier, now returned not through memories but through witness. Later that morning, a man walked into the cafe wearing a worn veteran's cap that didn't quite match his coat. He paused just inside the door, unsure whether this was the kind of place where someone like him belonged. Lana saw him, started to speak, but Noah, just back from the bus stop, stepped forward and opened the door a little wider. "Welcome back," he said, not like a waiter or a host, but like someone handing over a key to a locked room. The man blinked once, then smiled, shoulders lifting just slightly. Walt, watching from his booth, nodded in silent approval. That gesture was enough. No parade. No ceremony. Just the kind of acknowledgement that said, "You're seen. You're remembered." The record reached the end of its side, the needle rising in a slow curve before returning home. The cafe moved gently with it, dishes clinking, coffee brewing, and conversations beginning again, but not the same as before. Something had shifted, something quiet and enduring. Walt looked around the room and took a sip of his coffee. Then he reached for his fork and took the first bite of apple pie made from a recipe that had waited decades to return. It was sweet and familiar and full of something that didn't need a name. And for once, he didn't feel like just a man at a window. He felt like a piece of something that finally knew how to remember itself. The morning sun spread across the cafe floor like spilled honey, soft and slow and full of quiet invitation. The regulars had begun to arrive in a gentle trickle, but they moved differently now, as if every step inside Lester's cafe asked something more of them than coffee and conversation. No one raised their voice. No one laughed too loudly. There was a reverence in the air, not somber, not staged, but earned, like the hush of a chapel where no one preaches and yet everyone prays. Walt Strickland sat in his usual booth, a little straighter than before, a little less hidden. He stirred his coffee with the careful rhythm of someone who had no interest in rushing time anymore. The folded napkin with Travis's handwriting rested beside his cup. His wallet, worn and thick from the years, now held Noah's printed story and the memory of a promise he never broke. And today, he had something else to carry. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small photograph and the sealed letter he had once been too afraid to deliver. The photo showed Ellie, arms around two Marines, grinning wide with the kind of fearless joy only someone who had seen too much could still summon. The edges were bent, a little worn, but the image remained untouched by time. Her smile was still bright, still defiant. Walt placed both items on the table, then stood slowly. His body complained in the same familiar ways, but he welcomed the ache, it reminded him he was still here. He crossed the cafe floor toward the wall of honor, which had grown like a living memory across the back wall. Names now filled every inch, some with photos, others with notes or medals or even just a first name scrawled in shaky pen. The wall didn't care about perfection. It cared about presence. Lana stood behind the counter, wiping a clean glass that didn't need wiping, but her eyes tracked Walt with quiet attention. She watched him pause in front of the wall, the letter and photograph still in hand. She came around the counter slowly, stopping beside him without saying anything. Walt held out the photo and letter. "Hang these where people can remember someone real," he said. Lana took them gently, her fingers trembling just slightly as if she knew what she held but didn't trust herself to deserve it. She reached for an open spot just below Ellie's existing photo and carefully pinned the letter beneath it. Then, with great care, she placed the younger photograph beside it. For a moment, she stood back and looked at the space, her lips pressed together tightly. "She's home now," she whispered, just loud enough for Walt to hear. He nodded, then stepped back, eyes scanning the growing collage of faces and fragments. "They don't have to remember me," he said. "But they should remember her. She was the reason half of us ever made it out." Lana looked at him, tears barely held in check. "They'll remember," she said. "Because now it's right here. Where it always should have been." At that moment, the door opened again, and a gust of cold air swept through the cafe. A man stepped inside, middle-aged, clean-shaven, wearing a dark jacket with a patch on the sleeve and a veteran's cap that looked as though it had been worn in both rain and sun. He paused at the door, blinking against the light, uncertain if he belonged. Before Lana could welcome him, Noah, fresh from the bus stop, cheeks pink with the morning chill, stepped forward. He held the door open with both hands and looked up at the man with a smile that didn't ask questions or require credentials. "Welcome back," he said. The man blinked, his expression shifting from guarded to something softer. He nodded once, stepped fully inside, and let the door close behind him. He moved toward a booth, hat in hand, posture straight but tentative. He passed by the wall of honor and paused. His eyes scanned the faces, the photos, the folded letters and scribbled notes. Then he stood there for a while, not speaking, just looking. Back at his own booth, Walt watched it all with a stillness that wasn't cold but rooted. He'd seen too much to be surprised, but that didn't mean he wasn't moved. Noah returned to the table, slipping into the seat across from him. "Do you think she'd be proud?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Walt looked toward the wall, toward the image of Ellie laughing in the sun, a battlefield behind her and a song on her lips. "She'd probably roll her eyes first," he said, and for the first time that morning, he smiled. "Then she'd offer you coffee and scold me for making too much of a fuss." Noah chuckled, his fingers brushing across the edge of the table. "I'm going to write about her next," he said. "I want people to know who she was. Not just how she died, but how she lived." Walt nodded, something proud and quiet blooming in his chest. "She told stories, you know. All the time. About her family, her neighborhood, her grandmother's tamales. She made the worst days feel a little more like home. The jukebox, almost as if on cue, shifted songs and started a gentle instrumental, something from decades ago, full of warmth and a soft trumpet line that felt like sunlight spilling through blinds. Travis appeared from the back, carrying a tray of fresh pastries, but when he saw Walt and Noah talking, he paused. He didn't interrupt. He just moved to the counter and began placing the pastries with care, like setting them out for something more than sale. Lana returned behind the register, a new light in her eyes, the kind that flickers to life when something broken finds its way back to whole. Walt sipped his coffee and looked around the cafe. He saw faces he knew, some he didn't, but none of them felt unfamiliar anymore. The place hadn't changed completely, but the way it breathed had. It remembered now. It listened. And it spoke, not loudly, not with banners or ceremonies, but in the little ways that mattered most. A nod from a stranger. A smile from a child. A photo on a wall. A letter that never needed to be opened to be understood. He looked back at Noah, who was scribbling something new into his notebook. "What are you writing now?" Walt asked. Noah looked up. "Just the truth," he said. "About a woman named Ellie and a man who never let her be forgotten." Walt smiled again, softer this time, and turned to look once more at the wall of honor. For the first time in 50 years, it felt like her name had finally been spoken out loud, and it stayed. Her name was Ellie. And now, everyone knew. The following morning broke gently over flagstone, pulling back the darkness with soft hands and laying down threads of amber light across rooftops and frosted windshields. The town was still waking, but Lester's cafe was already alive. Its windows were fogged around the edges, kissed by the breath of early dawn, and a single candle flickered beneath the wall of honor, its glow steady and unwavering beneath Ellie Torres's photo. The flame danced not with grief but with remembrance, and the small brass record player behind the counter sent the slow beat of snare drums and the soft cry of trumpet into the corners of the room like a sacred echo. There were no big announcements. No signs. But people knew. They came because something had shifted, something invisible but undeniable. And they stayed because that shift made them feel part of something that mattered. Walt Strickland stepped into the cafe at 6:32 a.m., 5 minutes earlier than usual. He paused just past the door, his silhouette framed in the golden light behind him. The bell above the door chimed lightly, but this time it sounded more like a greeting than a reminder. He looked around, as he always did, not out of caution but out of habit, and found his booth waiting for him like an old friend. Lana was already pouring his coffee, the smell filling the room like the breath of something holy. She walked it around to his table without a word and set it down beside a folded napkin and a slice of apple pie. "Still using Ellie's recipe," she said, her voice soft and sure. Walt nodded and eased into the booth, his hands moving slower these days but no less certain. "Tastes closer every time," he replied, and took his first sip. At the far end of the cafe, Noah entered through the front door, his backpack slung over one shoulder, a manila folder clutched tightly in his arms. He spotted Walt immediately and made his way over with quiet purpose. "I brought something," he said, sliding into the seat across from the old man. He opened the folder and pulled out a new set of pages, freshly typed, bound with a red cover. "It's the final version," he explained. "I added Ellie's section. I included the wall, and your quote about how remembering costs less than forgetting." Walt took the booklet into his weathered hands and flipped through it slowly. His name was there, but it wasn't in bold. It wasn't the headline. It was nestled deep inside, woven into the story of a woman who sang lullabies in the dark and a boy who asked the right question. At the end of the manuscript was a dedication page, "To those who carry memory like a flame. And to those who light it for others." Walt closed the booklet and slipped it into his coat, next to the folded napkin Travis had given him, and the photo of Ellie that had never once left his side. "You've done something good," he said. "Something that will outlive both of us." Noah blushed and looked down. "I just wanted people to know what happened. I wanted them to see past the surface." Walt gave a quiet hum of agreement. "Most people never look," he said. "But sometimes, one does. And that's enough to wake up the world." At the register, Travis stood polishing a stack of glasses, his movements careful and quiet. He no longer carried his phone in his apron pocket. He no longer laughed too loud or spoke without listening. When he saw Walt glance his way, he gave a respectful nod and turned back to his work. It was a small thing, but small things, Walt had come to understand, were where change truly lived. Outside, the town moved on as towns do, mail trucks groaned past, buses hissed at stop signs, and early commuters pressed coffees to their lips without realizing they were passing by something sacred. Inside, the light from the candle beneath Ellie's photo danced higher for a moment as the front door opened again. A woman stepped in, bundled in a wool coat, her hair streaked with silver, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for something long lost. She moved toward the wall, her gaze caught on the letter pinned beneath Ellie's picture. Her hand rose slowly to her mouth as she read. Lana noticed her and came around the counter. "You knew her?" she asked gently. The woman nodded, eyes glassy. "She was my aunt. I was just a girl when she shipped out. We never knew what happened to her letter." Lana didn't speak. She only stepped aside, offering space. The woman reached out and touched the envelope with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered to no one and everyone. At his booth, Walt saw her. He saw the shape of Ellie's nose in her face, the same way her eyes crinkled when emotion threatened to spill over. He didn't interrupt. He didn't speak. He simply nodded once when her eyes met his, and she nodded back with tears sliding silently down her cheeks. For a long moment, that was all they needed. Noah looked over his shoulder and whispered, "Was that her niece?" Walt nodded. "Family always finds its way," he said. "Even if it takes 50 years. Later, as the sun climbed higher and the candle burned lower, the cafe continued to breathe in quiet rhythm. Mr. Hardwick held the door for a stranger. A teenager picked up a dropped spoon for someone they didn't know. Travis served coffee to a man who wore no uniform but was given the booth by the wall without question. No one spoke about what had changed. They just knew. They felt it in the way chairs were pushed in with care, in the way orders were placed with please and thank you, in the way the jukebox now let the record player sing first each morning. Walt finished his coffee and pie, stood slowly, and walked once more to the wall of honor. He looked at Ellie's photo, then at the letter beneath it. He placed a hand gently on the frame, his touch soft and steady. Noah joined him there, standing at his side in silence. The boy didn't ask anything more. He didn't need to. He had already received more truth than he had expected. They stood together for a while, watching the candle burn just a little longer, and when Walt finally turned to go, he touched the edge of the doorframe as he always did and looked up at the bell. "Still rings true," he said quietly. And as the door closed behind him, Lester's cafe returned to its rhythm, not faster, not busier, but better. A place where memory had a home, where names were no longer lost, and where the light, once lit, never stopped shining. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?